All right, folks, Dave Chappelle has a new Netflix special. It's called The Closer. Well, not sitting well with a number of LGBT organizations. GLAAD and others, including the National Black Justice Coalition, they are calling for Netflix to remove the special, saying Dave continues to make homophobic and transphobic comments. Last night, he had a screening of his documentary at the Hollywood Bowl. I was in attendance. He made it perfectly clear. He said he's not concerned. He is not going to get canceled. Joining us right now is David Johns. David leads, of course, the organization I was just speaking about. That is the preeminent black LGBT organization. So, David, glad to have you back on the show. So please explain to us, why should, from your perspective, Netflix remove this Dave Chappelle special?
First, let me say thank you, Roland, for creating space for us to have this conversation. I want to be clear in that it was the desire of the National Black Justice Coalition for us to do this, to have this conversation. And for me, it made sense to make this invitation to Brother Dave Chappelle to have versions of this conversation, including by demanding that Netflix take down the special, because Netflix has offered up resources to help us deal with many of the things that most of us who love black people care about, which is white supremacy. So I want to be clear in stating that I celebrate Dave Chappelle's comedic enterprise. I appreciate the ways in which so many people rest in the ability to laugh and celebrate and just take a break from the stress and trauma of being black in this country. And I continue to be astounded by what feels like a lazy attempt at this craft by someone who has demonstrated the ability to be a genius, and forgetting that there are some of us who are also black and LGBTQIA+. And so, again, all of this to say that I'm very well aware of Mr. Chappelle's comments about resting in the privilege that allows him to feel no regard for the implications of his comedy. And as someone who leads an organization that cares greatly about the overlooked and neglected needs of black, queer, trans, and non-binary people, I'd like us all to do a little bit better.
So how do you respond to folks who say, look, these are comedians. They talk about everybody. They talk about black people. They talk about gay people. They talk about trans people. They talk about women. They talk about politicians. Yeah. They talk about everybody. Many comedians say that's what comedians do. You're not going to a keynote speech. You're going to a comedy show. Right.
What I would acknowledge is, okay, and the next step is to talk about then what, right? So comedy is an art form. It's a form of entertainment that, when we think about the ways that Dave Chappelle has shown up, provides entree, right? Opportunities for us to think more critically and to engage more responsibly with each other. And so for me in particular, I am very much interested in this because Brother Chappelle and I purport to care about black people. And in particular, when the comedy could lead to black people, in particular, black people who are women, who are trans, queer, non-binary, who do not have the privilege to say, I don't care what people are saying about me because they're millionaires and have deals with Netflix, right? When we're talking about everyday people who don't have those privileges, I remain concerned about the implications of the jokes or the art form. And let's just keep it a buck, right? We're black people. And a part of this, what I've heard is people say, like, it's jokes. You should just be roasted. And there's two things that are important for me. One is that's about community, right? If I am in a situation where we're playing the dozens, we should be on equal footing. The ability for Dave Chappelle to make jokes about women and black trans folks, which are a race when we assume that all queer, trans, and non-binary folks are white, diminishes the ability for people to actually engage in a conversation or to punch back or to otherwise respond. And ultimately, what I'm continuing to try and remind people is that I care about black folks who are ignored and who are erased. It is the black lesbians who are beaten in Chelsea because of white supremacy and then made to be victims because their accusers highlight the ways in which their blackness overcomes the discrimination they experience as a result of their sexual identity or gender orientation. I remain concerned about Black trans students who are beaten in schools where people laugh at them and say that it is your fault, that if you had just shown up and been tougher and if you had not been sensitive, then this would not have been a thing. What I am concerned about is how people respond to the jokes, what people do as a result of the jokes. And to make this point particularly clear, there is a defense, a trans panic defense, which is often offered when Black trans women are murdered. I want to be clear that I offered this in the statement that I released, that MBJC released when this became a thing, which is to say that this matters at a point in time in which Black trans women are murdered at a disproportionate rate. That has happened every year since I've had the pleasure of leading this organization. And what I remain concerned about is that the murder, the violence against Black, queer, trans, and non-binary folks, the violence against Black women more generally is ignored when people say, oh, it's just a joke, you should laugh at it. There are some of us who don't have that privilege. And I would like for all of us to be able to have this conversation while celebrating that Dave Chappelle has the right to say what he wants to say. There are also some of us who should have the right to be critical of what it is that he says.
You said something there where you said that you're playing the dozen, you have the ability to actually punch back. But the reality is, comedians are on stage all across the country, all across the world. Whether it's a Netflix special, whether it's the Laugh Factory, whether it's any comedy venue in Chicago and New York, Houston, they're all over the country. So is there a difference when a comedian says something and they're talking about anybody? Don Rickles. Don Rickles ripped everybody. Lisa Lampanelli. I've heard people actually put on social media, they said if Bernie Mac was alive today, Bernie Mac would get canceled. Richard Pryor would get canceled. So is that part of this conversation? Are we establishing a separate standard? Are we trying to establish the same standard for comedians as we do politicians? Isn't that different being on the comedic stage?
Yeah, I'm not interested in establishing standards. What I'm interested in is all Black people being free. And more specifically, what I want is for Black women, Black, queer, trans, and non-binary folks to not be forced to make the decision to show up and be visible, to have public jobs that require us or invite us to have these conversations, or to be safe. What is missed is that jokes about beating up lesbian women and not liking trans women because they have Adam's apples, or reducing trans people to their genitalia is often a factor in the violence that members of our community experience. And so what I'm interested in is a more meaningful conversation where Black people in particular who purport to care about Black people are more conscious of the ways in which white supremacy is operationalized, and we do a better job to acknowledge intersectionality. I want to be clear, to the extent that I believe that it has been lost heretofore, that I appreciate what I believe is Dave Chappelle saying that that the dragon he is attempting to slay is white supremacy. That is why this matters to me. That is why it was important for MBJC to engage in this discussion. We care about Black people, all of us being free. Now, to the extent that the jokes, one, dismiss or provide cover for or allow people to get away with violence against our community, that's a point at which we have an issue. And again, the invitation is for us to have more meaningful conversations about the ways in which people use jokes, our humor, our comedy, to dismiss the things that actually are meaningful and show up as barriers in terms of our ability as Black people to live self-actualized lives, to be free, to other.
Questions from each one of my panelists. Let me lost David's audio. Y'all let me know when we actually have it back. So questions from each one of the panelists. First off, Tammy, your question for David Johns.
Mr. Johns, how do you reconcile, cancel culture being so easy for someone to just get canceled at this point, and something that I say a lot, clemency through ownership, which is literal and figurative. The figurative component meaning say sorry so you can be forgiven. So if Dave Chappelle were to apologize for his comments, would you still have the same sentiments of, pushing for him to be quote unquote canceled, given the fact that in this,
he's not apologizing. Just real quick, he ain't apologizing. Last night's show, he made it perfectly clear. No. He made it perfectly clear he ain't apologizing. And in fact, Stevie Wonder even came on stage and talked about what we should be canceling. He was there in support of Dave. All right, David, go ahead.
I don't know that I had anything to say. I was actually cut out of the conversation because of the audio. But again, I would just simply highlight that it must be nice.
No.
Right?
Okay, no, hold on. Okay, hold on. Dave, what's it? Dave, hold on. David, hold on. David, hold on. You didn't hear a question?
I did not. I heard the last part of your comment as I was able to come back in.
Tammy. So Tammy, restate your question to David so we can answer.
Please.
Okay, so be clear. Dave Chappelle is not apologizing. He said if this is what canceling is, he loves it, right? So my thing is, how do you reconcile, informing and educating the community, right, about the importance of not, being rude or belittling the LGBTQ community, but also not being so quick to cancel whenever our culture doesn't necessarily fully comprehend and understand the significance and the cultural impact of some of these statements sometimes. And I said that I always say clemency through ownership, which is literal and figurative. Say sorry to be forgiven.
Got it.
And we know that he's not going to apologize.
David?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tammy. Really thoughtful question. I want to acknowledge that this is not easy at all. There's no simple answer. I don't want to suggest that there is. I do want to name that it must be nice to rest in the privilege of being a millionaire who can say whatever you want without regard for how it might impact other people who do not have access to the privilege that you have been afforded to have access to, and just simply do and be and say. And again, what's challenging for me is knowing that the reality is that so many of us, not all of us, I don't purport to speak for all of us, but so many of us do not have that privilege. We are on track to have this year be the deadliest year with regard to the murders of Black trans women. And often, NBJC issues statements, much like the statement we issued around Dave Chappelle, around the murders of Black trans women, that doesn't get a modicum of the traction or energy that this has received. And so my hope is that while Mr. Chappelle continues to do whatever he will do because he's privileged enough to do that, that we will continue to have these conversations. And that as a community of people who purport to care about Black people, that we will do better, not only with regard to our language and with regard to how we have conversations with one another, but how we protect and support one another in more meaningful and measurable ways.
Michael.
All right. How you doing, David? Don't necessarily have so much of a question, but a comment and an observation here. And I've been reading this about Dave Chappelle. I haven't seen the special yet. One of the criticisms that he's getting is defense of comments that DaBaby made that people are saying were homophobic as well. And we know DaBaby got canceled and disinvited from different events. And the concern that I have is that when African Americans are dehumanized, whether it's in music, whether it's in specials called the N-word, B's, and things like this, the outrage doesn't take place to talk about removing that artwork that dehumanizes African Americans. But and very quickly here, so DaBaby got disinvited from different events and festivals for making homophobic remarks on stage that was not part of a song. It wasn't recorded, anything like that. But he got invited to the festivals after making songs that dehumanize Black people. And people are largely silent on that, okay? So that's the conflict that I have, okay? So, that's my perspective on this.
Okay.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And for me, the problem with the jokes and the presentation of this conversation via this big platform is that it affirms this lie that all Black people are cis, heterosexual, and think and operate in the same way, and all queer people are white. And that is a lie.
Right.
And so if we step back from that, the thing that I find frustrating is that most people are now engaging in this conversation without regard for the fact that, as Dave Chappelle referenced, DaBaby shot somebody in Walmart and then rapped about it in a song where he told his child, I would do it again. That is a problem. We talk so much about violence in the Black community. I want to offer a footnote. There are so many people who have been introduced to MBJC for the first time. Welcome to what we do. We're not new to this. We engage in similar conversations when we're talking about Tony McDade, the Black trans man who was murdered the same week that George Floyd was murdered by the Tallahassee Police Department. We show up and talk about and support Jasmine Koenig, a founder of this organization who has been in this space before, to talk about Ed Buck, a perpetrator of violence, systemic violence against Black, queer, and same-gender-loving men in particular. We show up and talk about this with regard to Nigel Shelby and Black students who are bullied and suspended. We agree in the space of wanting to ensure that all Black people can be free. For me, it's important to highlight for folks that don't have access to the information, who would never read a book about intersectionality, who don't know anything about Kimberly Crenshaw's groundbreaking essay mapping the intersections, to appreciate that as long as there have been Black people, there have been Black, queer, trans, and non-binary people. We have always been beautifully diverse. The issue with the special, and I encourage you to watch it, which is vexing for me in this space where I'm like, we shouldn't be continuing to talk about this, but it also provides us with opportunities to talk about this, is to simply say this. We agree. We're only having this conversation because Dave Chappelle says in the special, I care about Black people, and my issue is white supremacy. What is missed so often, particularly with regard to Mr. Chappelle's comedy, is that intersectionality is a thing. And there are Black, queer, trans, and non-binary, non-conforming people. And it is us, not white people. It is not white queer people. He talks about LGBTQ people as if they are white and talks about the movement that they are winning. It is them, white folks, who win, not us. When these jokes happen without this critical conversation, it is Black, queer, trans, and non-binary people who are victims of the kind of violence that he jokes about, who get beaten up because their Adam's apple is too large, or because their hands are too big, or because they do not show up in the ways that white people and the things that we all hold to this level of being the things that we should all do. When we are not able to achieve that, we are the victims of it. And that is the thing that I care most about. I also want to be clear that this is not about, to the extent that we can't cancel Dave Chappelle. Roland has made this apparently clear. He's been on Instagram with all of his friends. This is about us as Black folks who purport to care about Black folks doing better.
Kelly.
First and foremost, thank you, David, for coming on and speaking about this. I'm a huge fan of yours. I follow you on everything. But I wanted to make clear how, and it's more of a comment than a question, but I would love your thoughts on it, how cancel culture has been just very conflated when it comes to accountability. I don't see this as being a canceling Dave Chappelle notion so much as it is the fact that all Black lives matter, and Dave Chappelle and other people who have the privilege of having a platform as large as Netflix need to be held accountable to the notion that all Black lives matter, that there are ways to be funny and to critique culture and to critique society without disparaging the most marginalized among us, especially within the Black community. And and finally, well, kind of finally, I saw a lot of comments over the past couple of days, and I want to make note that I have not seen the special, but his previous specials also touched on this, so I feel like I can say a little bit of it. But the fact that people are saying, oh, you're violating his First Amendment rights, et cetera, people forget that the First Amendment was made to protect the most marginalized voices among the American body. So the fact that we are still silencing the most marginalized within the marginalized community that is Black people by saying that, you know, Dave Chappelle is able to say whatever he wants simply because he's a Black man, that is a disservice to not only Dave Chappelle and the LGBTQ plus community, but it's also a disservice to how the First Amendment is supposed to be exercised. So it's like, why is it that the most marginalized among us have to remain silent when the First Amendment is actually supposed to protect them?
I love you, and not just because you were singing my song, but because you were thinking critically. And I want to be clear that I don't expect, nor do I want people to always agree with me, but I do want us to be able to have conversations about how we do better to ensure that all of us can get free. And the thing that I've struggled most with is the hypocrisy of so many people who have continued to say to me, it's just a joke. I found it funny, therefore you should say nothing about it. If Dave Chappelle had the freedom to make jokes, as he will clearly continue to do, I and other people should have the freedom to say, I watched the special twice over. I also know that this is not new, and I didn't find it funny. And two truths can exist at the same time. Beyond that, to your point, Kelly, I will continue to say that my issue and interest is in ensuring that all of us can be free. We are now actively having a fight, a conversation that hopefully will lead to us being able to pass the Equality Act. And the issue for me is that too many Black people consider the Equality Act a gay piece of legislation, something that will benefit white gay people or LGBTQ people generally, because again, the assumption is that all gay people are queer. And the reality is it's a civil rights piece of legislation. It addresses fundamental gaps in legislation that exist around the pieces of legislation that most Black people will name when they talk about the things that they care most about with regard to civil rights, right? This includes things like ensuring that Black women cannot be fired because of the way that they wear their hair, ensuring that all of us cannot be kicked out of a rideshare like an Uber or a Lyft because of the way that we show up in the world. I care about Black people. I really don't care as much about what George Carlin has to say or Rosie O'Donnell. What I care about is acknowledging that in this moment, there is someone who has an extreme platform, who has an extreme amount of wealth, an extreme amount of privilege, who purports to care about Black people. And I'm simply saying that if you purport to care about Black people, I would like to know if you actually care about all of us. And for me, that's the question that is being pressed at this moment. Heretofore, it has been possible for folks to say, I care about Black people, and that be code word for saying, I care about some of us. Those of us who show up in the ways that affirm me and the way that I make sense of the way that I show up in the world. The question now is, do you care about all of us? And here's the thing, we can disagree. You can say to me, I only care about Black cis straight folks. I only care about Black folks from New York. And that's fine. I just need to know where you are because there is so much more work to do to ensure that we can all be free. That's my goal.
Thank you.
David Johns, National Black Justice Coalition. We surely appreciate it, David. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you.
Folks, back to that Roland Martin unfiltered video in just one moment.
Time to be smart.
Roland Martin's doing this every day.
Oh, no punches!
Thank you, Roland Martin, for always giving voice to the issues.
Look for Roland Martin in the whirlwind, to quote Marcus Garvey again.
The video looks phenomenal, so I'm really excited to see it on my big screen.
Support this man, Black media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
See, this difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
I got to defer to the brilliance of Dr. Carr and to the brilliance of the Black Star Network.
I am rolling with Roland all the way.
Honored to be on a show that you own. A Black man owns the show.
Folks, Black Star Network is here.
I'm real revolutionary right now. Roland was amazing on there.
Stay black. I love y'all.
I can't commend you enough about this platform that you've created for us to be able to share who we are, what we're doing in the world, and the impact that we're having.
Let's be smart. Bring your eyeballs home.
You can't be black-owned media and be scared. You dig?